In 1891, a fishing crew on the Delaware River hauled in a single sturgeon so large it took 4 men to lift it onto the dock. Its belly was packed with roe, pale gray, glistening, worth almost nothing to the men who caught it. They sold the meat for a few cents a pound. The eggs, salted and packed into barrels, were shipped to New York, relabeled, and sold to European buyers as fine Russian caviar. Nobody along the Delaware thought twice about it. Sturgeon were everywhere. Rivers up and down the east coast of America were so thick with them that bartenders in Albany scooped roe onto free crackers just to make customers thirsty enough to keep ordering beer. Sturgeon meat itself had a nickname among the poor and the working class of upstate New York. They called it Albany beef. Free food, salty, plain, unremarkable. And yet within 30 years, wild sturgeon populations on the east coast of the United States had collapsed almost entirely, hunted to commercial extinction to feed a European appetite for something that Americans themselves treated as bar snacks. Today, a single ounce of the finest caviar on earth can sell for more than $400. A kilogram of top-grade wild beluga, back when it could still legally be sold, once fetched close to $10,000 on the wholesale market. But there is a species behind all of this money, all of this obsession, all of this near extinction that predates the dinosaurs. Sturgeon have been swimming in the rivers of this planet for roughly 200 million years, surviving mass extinctions that wiped out nearly everything else alive at the time. They survived asteroid impacts. They did not survive the 20th century particularly well. So how did the eggs of one of the oldest surviving fish species on Earth, once handed out free with beer in American saloons, become the single most expensive food most people will ever taste? And how did an entire sea, shared by 5 nations, get fished so hard that the fish behind it all nearly vanished forever? That story does not start in Paris or Moscow. It starts on the shores of the Caspian Sea, more than 2,000 years ago, long before anyone had a word for caviar at all. The Caspian Sea sits landlocked between modern Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Azerbaijan, the largest enclosed body of water on the planet. Into it flow several rivers, chief among them the Volga, and up those rivers every spring sturgeon have migrated to spawn for longer than there have been humans to watch them do it. Ancient peoples along the Caspian and the Black Sea, Persians, Scythians, and later Greeks trading along the coastline noticed something specific about these fish. Female sturgeon carried enormous quantities of eggs, sometimes representing close to a quarter of the animal's entire body weight. Someone, and history does not record exactly who, first tried salting those eggs to preserve them. This was not a complicated insight. Salting fish was already common practice across the ancient Mediterranean and the Near East. But sturgeon roe responded to salt curing in a way other fish eggs did not. Lightly salted, it stayed soft, buttery, and edible for weeks rather than days. In a world without refrigeration, that difference mattered enormously. This was not a delicacy invented for royalty. It was a preservation technique invented out of necessity by fishing communities trying not to waste an enormous protein-rich harvest that spring floods delivered right to their nets. The word caviar itself likely descends from a Persian term, caviar, later passed through Turkish and into the trading languages of the Mediterranean. Persian texts describe sturgeon roe as a prized food more than 2,000 years ago, and some ancient Greek writers noted sturgeon as a fish of particular status at banquets. There is a persistent story, repeated in countless food histories, that ancient Greeks brought sturgeon to the table with actual trumpet fanfare, announcing its arrival the way a modern restaurant might present a birthday cake. Whether that detail is literally true or an embellishment added centuries later by writers eager for a colorful anecdote remains genuinely debated among historians. But the fact that the story survived at all, attached specifically to this fish and no other, tells you something about how early sturgeon roe carved out a reputation for itself as food worth talking about. For the next several centuries, that reputation stayed relatively regional, tied closely to the empires and cultures that bordered the Caspian and Black Seas. Persian court cuisine folded salted sturgeon roe into its broader tradition of preserved delicacies. Russian principalities along the Volga developed their own salting methods independently, refining the process generation after generation, passed down among fishing families rather than written into any formal recipe book. Sturgeon fishing became one of the defining economic activities of the lower Volga region, feeding local populations and generating a modest but real trade in preserved roe that moved along river and caravan routes towards Central Asia and the Middle East. It was not yet a luxury good in the way the modern world understands luxury. It was a regional specialty, valuable but not exclusive. Nobody was guarding sturgeon roe the way merchants guarded silk routes or spice monopolies. It simply had not yet reached the markets that would eventually turn it into something rare. That began to change as Russian territorial power expanded southward and eastward across the 1500s and 1600s. As the Tsardom of Russia consolidated control over the lower Volga and eventually over long stretches of Caspian coastline, sturgeon fishing came under increasing state attention. This is where caviar starts to look less like folk food and more like the first civilization built around it. Russian czars recognized the commercial and diplomatic value of high-quality sturgeon roe and began treating the richest fishing grounds as something closer to a controlled resource, taxed, monitored, and reserved in part for court consumption and gifting to foreign dignitaries. Caviar entered Russian court cuisine as a marker of hospitality and status, served at state banquets and offered to visiting ambassadors as a demonstration of the empire's wealth and its command over the natural resources of its rivers. This was the first time caviar functioned as something close to currency, not literal coinage, but a signal of favor, alliance, and imperial generosity, deployed the way gold or fine textiles might be deployed elsewhere. Meanwhile, in medieval and early modern England, sturgeon was heading in a completely different direction, one that had almost nothing to do with fine dining and everything to do with royal property law. In the year 1324, under King Edward II, English law formally declared sturgeon a royal fish. Any sturgeon caught in English waters legally belonged to the crown, the same designation given to whales and porpoises. This law remains, at least in a symbolic sense, on the books in the United Kingdom to this day. But here is the detail that makes this strange. Nobody in medieval England was eating caviar the way Persian or Russian courts were. English sturgeon law was almost entirely about the meat, a large, impressive fish considered fit for a king's table on the rare occasions one was caught in British rivers. The roe itself received comparatively little attention. Europe, broadly, took a very long time to catch up to what the Caspian world already understood about sturgeon eggs. And when caviar did eventually reach Western European markets in meaningful quantities, it was met with something closer to confusion than admiration. 16th and 17th century European travelers to Russia occasionally wrote home describing salted fish eggs with a mixture of curiosity and mild disgust, an unfamiliar texture, and an intensely briny flavor that did not immediately map onto Western European palates trained on butter, bread, and roasted meat. Caviar was, for a long stretch of European history, treated as a somewhat exotic curiosity from the East rather than a luxury worth importing at scale. There is also a persistent legend, repeated in food histories though difficult to verify with primary sources, that in parts of colonial America, where sturgeon were so abundant in rivers like the Hudson and the Delaware that fishermen considered them a nuisance clogging their nets, indentured servants and apprentices occasionally negotiated contracts specifying they would not be fed sturgeon or its roe more than a certain number of times per week. Whether every detail of that story holds up to scrutiny remains uncertain, and versions of similar servant contract legends exist attached to salmon in other regions as well. But the underlying reality is not in dispute. Sturgeon, and by extension caviar, was for centuries treated in large parts of the world as common food, abundant, cheap, and thoroughly unglamorous. This is where the story takes a turn nobody watching from those early centuries could have predicted. The turning point for caviar as a global luxury good came not from a king or an emperor, but from two brothers, Armenian émigrés named Melkum and Musha Petrosyan, working in Paris in the years following the First World War. The Petrosian brothers recognized something that Russian traders had known internally for centuries, but that Western European high society had never fully experienced. Properly cured Caspian sturgeon roe, prepared using a refined 19th century Russian technique known as malisol, meaning little salt, was an extraordinary product when handled correctly. The malisol method used only a small percentage of salt by weight, typically somewhere around 4%, just enough to preserve the roe without masking its delicate flavor. The Petrosians began importing this high-grade, lightly salted Caspian caviar directly into Paris, marketing it aggressively to the city's wealthiest restaurants, hotels, and private clients throughout the 1920s. Whether every detail of how quickly Parisian high society embraced the product is preserved with perfect historical precision remains a matter of some dispute among food historians, but the outcome is not in question. Within a remarkably short span of years, caviar transformed from a curiosity into an emblem of European sophistication, served in the finest establishments of Paris, and from there, London, New York, and beyond. The Petrosian name itself became and remains today virtually synonymous with luxury caviar. This was not an accident of taste, it was a deliberate act of branding, applied to a product that had existed largely unnoticed by Western elites for well over 1,000 years. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the story of caviar is about to turn from a story of glamour into one of the most severe near-extinction crises any food source on the planet has faced in modern history. Through the middle decades of the 20th century, the Soviet Union recognized what Petrosian had proven in Paris and moved to fully monopolize Caspian caviar production and export. Sturgeon fishing along the Volga Delta and the broader Caspian coastline came under strict state control. Caviar became not just a luxury export earning valuable foreign currency for the Soviet state, but a genuine instrument of diplomacy, offered as gifts to foreign heads of state and deployed at high-level negotiations the same way fine cognac or rare art might be. Production quotas were set centrally, fishing was licensed and monitored, and for several decades this system, whatever its flaws, at least imposed some structure on how many sturgeon could be taken from the Caspian each season. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, collapsed the entire regulatory framework that had, however imperfectly, been managing Caspian sturgeon populations for generations. This is the part of the story that does not get enough attention, and it deserves full weight. In the chaotic years following the Soviet collapse, sturgeon fishing along the Caspian effectively became a free-for-all. State fishing fleets that had once operated under central quotas splintered into independent operators with no enforcement mechanism watching them. Organized crime networks moved rapidly into the caviar trade, recognizing an enormously profitable, barely policed resource sitting at the intersection of 5 newly independent or newly destabilized nations: Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Iran, none of which had functioning joint enforcement in place. Poaching exploded. Illegal caviar, harvested with no regard for sturgeon age, maturity, or population sustainability, flooded black markets across Europe and beyond, often smuggled out under falsified export documentation. The consequences were catastrophic, and they were fast. Wild sturgeon populations in the Caspian Sea, the source of the overwhelming majority of the world's historic caviar supply, declined by an estimated 90% or more within roughly 2 decades following the Soviet collapse. 90%. Species that had survived roughly 200 million years, multiple mass extinction events, and the entire span of human civilization were pushed to the edge of collapse within a single generation of unregulated commercial greed. This was not a slow natural decline. This was a direct, documented result of a regulatory vacuum meeting an enormously lucrative black market. The beluga sturgeon, the largest species and the source of the most prized and expensive caviar, was hit especially hard because larger, older females carrying the most valuable roe were also the most heavily targeted by poachers, and beluga sturgeon can take upward of 20 years to reach reproductive maturity in the first place. Killing a mature female beluga for her roe removes decades of reproductive potential from the population in a single act. This was not sustainable harvesting. This was liquidation. The international response, when it finally came, was significant, but arrived only after enormous damage had already been done. In 1998, sturgeon species were listed under Appendix 2 of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, commonly known as CITES, placing strict controls and permitting requirements on any international trade in wild sturgeon products, caviar included. In the mid-2000s, the United States went further, listing beluga sturgeon under the Endangered Species Act and banning the import of wild beluga caviar into the American market entirely, starting in 2005. For a fish and a food product that had survived every prior era of human history relatively intact, it took only a few decades of post-Soviet chaos to bring it to the brink, and only global regulatory intervention to pull it back from the edge, at least partially. Wild Caspian sturgeon populations, even today, remain a fraction of what they were before the collapse, and several species remain critically endangered. This is where the story turns, again in a direction almost nobody would have predicted a century earlier. If wild sturgeon could no longer sustainably supply the world's growing appetite for caviar, and if international law was rapidly closing off the wild trade entirely, the only remaining path forward was farming the fish directly. Sturgeon aquaculture is not simple. Unlike farming salmon or trout, which reach market size and reproductive maturity within a year or two, sturgeon are astonishingly slow to mature. Depending on the species, farmed sturgeon can take anywhere from 8 to 20 years, and in the case of beluga, sometimes closer to 25 years, before a female is ready to produce harvestable roe. Think about that for a second. An entrepreneur investing in a sturgeon farm today is making a bet on a payoff that might not fully materialize for a quarter of a century. This is not a business model built for anyone chasing quick returns. It requires patience, enormous upfront capital, and a genuine long-term commitment. Three things that are in famously short supply in most modern industries. And yet, starting in the 1970s and 80s, pioneers in a handful of countries took exactly that bet. In Italy, a company that would eventually become known for its Calvisius caviar brand began serious sturgeon farming operations, eventually becoming one of Europe's leading producers of farmed caviar raised in controlled freshwater conditions rather than pulled from a collapsing wild fishery. In the United States, sturgeon farms established in California, particularly around the Sacramento region, began raising white sturgeon specifically for domestic caviar production, offering American buyers a legal, traceable, environmentally regulated alternative to increasingly restricted wild imports. But the country that would eventually come to dominate global caviar production was not Russia, not Iran, and not the United States. It was China. Beginning in the 2000s, Chinese aquaculture companies invested enormous resources into sturgeon farming, particularly in Zhejiang province, taking advantage of favorable growing conditions, significant government and private investment, and a willingness to commit to the long maturation timelines that scared off less patient competitors. One Chinese producer, founded in the mid-2000s and now widely known under the Kaluga Queen brand, grew within roughly a decade to become the single largest caviar producer on the planet. Here is the twist nobody saw coming 100 years earlier, when caviar meant the Caspian and the Caspian meant Russia and Persia. Today, China produces a majority of the world's farmed caviar supply, an almost unthinkable outcome to anyone drinking champagne with Petrosian caviar in 1920s Paris. The modern caviar market reflects just how completely the industry has been remade. Global caviar production today is estimated at several hundred metric tons annually, worth several $100 million in total market value, and that figure continues to grow as farmed caviar becomes more widely available and, relatively speaking, more affordable than the wild product ever was in its final scarce decades. The finest wild beluga caviar, back when it could still be legally traded, commanded prices in the range of $8,000 to $10,000 per kilogram on the high end of the wholesale market. Farmed caviar today, while still unmistakably a luxury product, sells at a fraction of those historic wild peaks, though the very best small batch farmed caviar, particularly aged beluga hybrid varieties, can still command prices well into the hundreds of dollars per ounce at retail.
But caviar is far more than just a food today, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Caviar extract has become a genuine ingredient in the cosmetics and skincare industry, marketed for its high concentration of amino acids, fatty acids, and micronutrients. Luxury skincare brands, most famously La Prairie with its long-running caviar-infused product line, have built entire product categories around the idea that the same roe once smuggled across borders by post-Soviet criminal networks can also be rubbed onto your face at considerable expense. There is also a growing market for caviar-infused spirits and condiments, extending the brand well beyond the dinner plate. Money, quite literally in this case, did not just grow on trees. It grew inside a fish that has been swimming on this planet since before flowering plants existed. It was there, in the ancient river deltas of the Caspian and Volga, salted by fishing communities simply trying not to waste their catch. It was there in Persian courts and early Russian imperial banquets, treated as a marker of hospitality and imperial reach. It was there, ironically, as free bar food in American saloons, tossed onto crackers to sell more beer. It was there in 1920s Paris, rebranded by two ambitious brothers into the very definition of European luxury. It was there through Soviet diplomacy, handed across negotiating tables as a tool of statecraft. It was there in the lawless years after the Soviet collapse, driving one of the fastest and most severe wildlife population crashes of the modern era. A nearly 200-million-year-old survivor brought to the edge of extinction in barely 2 decades. And it is there today, farmed patiently over decades in China, Italy, and California, spooned onto blinis at wedding receptions, and, somewhat bizarrely, massaged into anti-aging face cream. Not bad for the eggs of a fish nobody in colonial Albany thought was worth paying for. If any part of this surprised you, the wild American sturgeon collapse, the near extinction after the Soviet Union fell, or the fact that China now leads the world in caviar production, let me know in the comments which detail caught you off guard. And if you want more stories like this, tracing the strange, high-stakes histories hiding behind the everyday and the exclusive alike, do me a favor and hit subscribe. There is always another story like this one waiting. I will see you in the next one.